So firstly, what is interpretation? Basically, how we communicate stories of our buildings and heritage to audiences. That is it in a nutshell. It's about how we communicate what's really special about heritage and how we tell the story of the people and events that are connected to our heritage. And ultimately, it's about how we connect the heritage that we're looking after with audiences. Otherwise, it's kind of just heritage and no one knows about it. It's about how we actually make that emotional connection and engagement between the heritage and the audiences who we want to engage. If anyone has done any interpretation training before, I'm sure Freeman Tilden is a name that you will know. He's kind of the godfather of interpretation. So he wrote in the 1950s, but I'd really recommend if you're interested in interpretation, reading more of his work. He kind of said it all. There's been lots of authors since talk about interpretation, but he's someone who you should definitely refer to. So he would say, interpretation is an educational activity which aims to reveal meaning and relationships through the use of original objects by first-hand experience and by illustrative media, rather than to simply communicate factual information. And I think that is really, really important. This interpretation isn't about just giving facts and figures. It's not about instruction and information. It's about interpreting information to make it really meaningful to people and people's lives. Of course, interpretation like text panels, like the one you can see behind us, can include facts and figures, but that's not the main reason for interpretation. It's really important that interpretation is meaningful, that it really means something to people, that it reveals things about heritage that people might not have known before, that it's provoking, maybe it's thought-provoking. It's related to people's personal experiences, and you're going to hear me talk about that a lot. And it also helps to develop in people an understanding of the heritage and an appreciation of the heritage. So when you are planning interpretation, as with just normal project management, it's really important to start with aims and objectives. So firstly, what do you actually want your interpretation to achieve? We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Why are you doing it? What's the point? What impacts do you want it to have on people? Secondly, what are you actually interpreting? Is it a site? Is it built heritage? Is it a collection, an event, a person, a time period? Is it a combination of those things? And it's really important to think, why are you doing it? What's the point? Why is it really important that the thing you are going to engage people with, why is it important that story needs to be told? Why is it really important that people need to know about the thing that you're interpreting? What are they going to think about in 6 months? What's the change that you're going to enact in them? Think about what's really significant about the thing you're interpreting. Obviously, any topic has a multitude of things that we could say about it. Even if you're just interpreting, for example, if you're in a museum and you were just interpreting one object, you could say so many different things about it: the materiality, the color, where it's from, who made it, how it was used. What's really, really significant? And in terms of built heritage, that often is, I would argue, that of course, the architecture and the time period, but often it's about the people, the places, the events connected. What is it that brought that heritage to life? You need to think about your audiences. And again, we'll talk about that a bit later, but what do they need? How does your interpretation meet audience needs? And what do you want your audiences to go away with as a result of engaging with your interpretation? Generic learning outcomes are something that you may know. They've been around for quite a long time now, developed in part by the University of Leicester. They are still a really great, I still use them all the time to plan interpretation, because they help us think about the impacts that we want interpretation to have on audiences. So what's the change that you want to see as a result of someone engaging with your interpretation? And the generic learning outcomes are in terms of knowledge and understanding. So that's what information might people learn, what new understanding might they have as a result of engaging with your interpretation. Skills, so might someone develop a new skill? Might they learn how to, tie a historical knot? Might they learn how to do a heritage craft? Attitudes and values, so will the interpretation that you create shift someone's attitudes and values towards a topic? Will it make them think about something in a new way? Enjoyment, inspiration and creativity. And I think that's a really important one, that of course not all topics are fun, but is there a way, you know, how are audiences going to be inspired by what you're saying? Are they going to get enjoyment from it? And activity, behavior and progression is all about what they'll do as a result of seeing or experiencing your interpretation. So might they go away and learn more about a topic? Might they actually go and volunteer for you? Or what will they do in a few months' time as a result of engaging? Messaging is really important. So if you think about maybe some interpretation that you saw 6 months ago, maybe you've been to an exhibition or you've been to a visitor attraction, I bet you can't remember, unless you've got a better memory than me, or every single thing that you read and experienced. We simply don't remember every single thing that we take in. However, so we really need to think about, what do we want audiences to remember? What do we want them to go away with as a result of experiencing our interpretation? And thinking about messaging is thinking about, you know, what messages do we want to give to people? So think about what's relevant to your audiences, what messages might really resonate with them. What do you actually have information about? So what is it possible to talk about within your interpretation? If there is an aspect of the history of your building that you just don't know about, and it's very difficult to get any research about it, then it's not the best message or topic to talk about with people. Which messages really reveal something interesting about the subject? Again, think about what change you want to influence in visitors. And also remember that, as I said before, you can't talk about the entirety of a topic. It's just not possible, and it wouldn't be interesting for people. But what could you provoke in people that makes them then want to go away and do some research in their own time? You might spark an interest that then they go away and really think about and, you know, read up about. In terms of messaging as well, the first thing you need to think about is, what is the big idea of your interpretation? What is the broad overarching message that you really want people to go away with? And I really like this example that I've used. It's from Chester Zoo, and I have to say zoos are brilliant at this, I think, because they have a really clear idea of the messages that they want visitors to go away with. So if you ever have the opportunity to go to Chester Zoo, the interpretation there is incredible. And can be applied to all different contexts. So the broad overarching message here is really clear. Deforestation is a major threat to wildlife around the world. Then think about, within that big idea, that big thing you want people to go home with, what are the other messages and themes that feed into that? So the example I can give is, I recently did a pop-up exhibition about the history of women's football as part of the Women's Euros. And the big idea was that women have always played football over time, that women's football was banned for a while, but even during that ban, women persevered and continued to play football. But within that big overarching message, we also wanted to talk about, you know, to change people's attitudes. People who think that women can't play football, we wanted to make them go away and realise, yes, we can. And we also wanted them to learn more information about specific time periods of women's football. So what are the messages within that big idea? You really need to keep those in mind as you create your interpretation. Every aspect of your interpretation, whether you're writing a text panel, creating an exhibition, creating a podcast, whatever it might be, needs to absolutely scream your messages. Everyone who is experiencing that interpretation should go away knowing what you want them to know. And before you finalize your interpretation, I'd always say to test it with colleagues and with audiences to make sure that the messages you want to transmit are really clear in your interpretation. It's also really important to tell engaging stories, and that might sound kind of simple, but it's true. So how do we tell engaging stories? Again, really think about what's significant about your heritage. People really like people. It's really great to talk about people, places and events that people today can relate to and understand and connect to their own lives. So what's relevant to people? What emotions do you want to evoke? And that can be a whole range of emotions. It might be a whole range of emotions within a visit, or it might be, you know, different emotions in different interpretation. How are you going to help your visitors empathize and understand the past and get a real appreciation of the past? And how are you going to make your interpretation relevant to visitors? So across time, you know, there are themes across time: love and relationships, the need to eat, the need to live somewhere. These are big universal themes that we can all relate to. So how can you incorporate those big themes into your interpretation so audiences today understand the past? And think about whether you want it to be a first person narrative, which can be really compelling in terms of feeling like you're hearing from, you know, voices from the past, or tell an overall narrative like the example I've given on this slide. It's really important to think about language, obviously, particularly in written or spoken interpretation. Has to be really well structured. There's a whole session I could do about writing a text panel, but really important to stick to the key points. And that's why it's important to know what messages you're trying to give out. It should be easy to digest and appropriate to the audience you're trying to reach and the method of interpretation you're using. I like this. This is at Castlefield Viaduct that the National Trust has just opened. It's just really, really simple interpretation. And I've remembered that fact. I went last week and I can still remember that fact because it's just really simple. I was able to read it in a couple of seconds. Consider attention spans. People don't have huge attention spans broadly at this time. And also think about the types of audience. This is really interesting. It's interesting to think of audience in terms of streakers, strollers, and studiers. So streakers will just read a single line of a panel. They just want something really attention grabbing. They're not going to read everything that you write. Strollers might want a 50-word summary, and then studiers, who will go to a deeper level, still only want about 250 words if you're thinking about a text panel. Like it's really easy to write everything and overwhelm people. So really think about making things clear and accessible. So thinking about methods of interpretation, there's lots and lots of methods of interpretation, and I'm sure I'll be missing some out, but I've tried to include as many as I can. When you're thinking about methods of interpretation, so what kind of interpretation to use to tell your story, the considerations: work within your resources. So how much time do you have? What is the capacity of the people that will be creating the interpretation? And what is what funding do you have? All of that is really important to consider. Think about different learning styles and audience needs. So you might have, for example, some text panels, you might have some sculpture, you might have some oral histories. So people with different learning styles can access the interpretation. Think about the space you're using. So especially, you know, in a historic house or the built environment, think about conservation, think about the fragility of the space. Be sensitive to the space. If you've got a big, you know, archaeological excavation, you don't really want to litter that field with lots of signs because it will totally take away from the kind of spirit and sense of the place. So you might therefore use maybe digital, like a QR codes or a podcast to talk about that. And think about legal protection. So, you know, can you put signage up in places? Do you have to go through planning laws? Think about whether your interpretation's temporary or permanent. And also think about all the opportunities for interpretation. So we quite often think about sort of exhibitions and interpreting spaces within a site. But if you've got a site that has, you know, toilets or a cafe or seating, can you use them to tell stories? So Norwich Castle Museum, I don't have a picture of it, unfortunately, but their toilets, all of the sinks have little facts on them that they're amazing. And Langham Dome, which is a World War II heritage centre in North Norfolk, the picnic tables outside have really lovely interpretation on them to tell the story of the dome. And also think about co-creation. So can you work with audiences to research, plan, or create your interpretation? I should apologize at this point that I'm not some kind of like narcissist, but there's quite a lot of pictures of me because it's all from my camera roll. So apologies for all the pictures of me. So firstly, types of interpretation: live interpretation or people interpretation. So that's where I think it's one of the most effective ways to interpret the past. Interaction with people really helps bring stories to life for visitors. So that might be things like having tour guides, room stewards, having expert talks, costumed interpreters. So this was a Victorian event that I did. That could be things like living history camps. It could be demonstrations of heritage crafts. It could be tours with people in costume. It could be scripted. So, for example, a sort of a performance that happens every hour, or a play, or it could be improvised, where people in costume, kind of just talk to visitors and improvise what they're going to say. There's also alternatives. It is obviously costly sometimes, unless you just work with volunteers, and that's obviously costly in terms of volunteer management, to have in-person interpretation. So if you can't actually have people on your site, think about other ways that you can incorporate people's voice into your interpretation. So that might be through a podcast, blogs, videos. Think it could be, you could have a costumed interpreter talking on video, or you could have a projection of them on a site. So think about all the ways that you can incorporate people into your interpretation. Written interpretation on site is something that I'm sure we'll all be familiar with. So as I said before, again, text panels, there's lots we could say about that, but really important on text panels not to write too much. The one that I wrote actually for the Euros, I look at it and I think, there was a bit too much writing on that. It's really, like, I would say 250 to 300 words, and being very clear about having one idea per sentence and just one topic per panel. Don't confuse people by having lots of different information on panels. Again, the giant otter is from Chester Zoo, and I just think that's really great. It tells a story in a minimal amount of words. Or text labels, and obviously plaques as well that interpret particular objects or specific buildings. Self-guided tours. So the good thing about self-guided tours is that visitors set their own pace, and there might be no or very little requirement for staff or volunteers to support that. So that could be having a big guidebook. Again, think about audiences that might want a guidebook. Fewer places have them, I think, these days, because they're quite a lot to read, and they might be quite expensive for audiences if you need to sell them at cost. But they can be really great if you want to talk, really go into detail about the site. Leaflets, site maps, having floor plans that people can walk around with, and also trails. So digital trails, you can online, or using QR codes, or having plaques on the floor that people follow to highlight different histories is really a great way of interpreting. Artistic interpretation, I've probably not included every single thing I could have done here, but I love artistic interpretation, and it covers a really broad range of things. It can be working with artists to create interpretation, or it could be working with, community groups and schools. That can include things like art installations that tell stories, murals, mosaics, graphic timelines, marking signs. So if your site, for example, used to have buildings that are no longer there, having signs to mark where they used to be. Street art, superimposed photos, so where you can see the modern view of the streets with a superimposed photo of what it used to look like on top of it. Using hoardings, projections. So the thing at the bottom of the screen, the picture is from Sheringham Park, and that was a beautiful light projection that told the story of the development of the park. Or digital 3D modeling, where you show the kind of how a building's evolved over time. Audiovisual interpretation on site, that can include things like videos, immersive experiences, sound installations, oral histories. So these are examples from the one on the right is from the SS Great Britain, which I really love. I think the interpretation there is sensational. and you walk into that room and there's kind of a mock-up of the room, but then in front of you is a projection playing of actors acting out a story, which is really great and really immersive. And then the thing on the left is, you'll all be used to this, kind of digital interactive that allows people to really have a closer look at tapestries. So using kind of digital means to bring stories to life. Digital interpretation, where you're using visitors' own technology. So I've shared London Historic Buildings Trust Instagram and Twitter feed here, which is a really great way to interpret the past. Having information on your website, having downloadable resources and tours, as I said, using social media and incorporated into social media, as well as using images, you can also use video. You could have your own hashtag that tells stories about your site, and using QR codes that direct visitors to more information about a site. And finally, I definitely count this as interpretation because I think it still helps interpret the past. Again, sorry about the picture of me. So this was actually from a Victorian event, and all of the visitors were invited to dress up. This is one that I attended as a visitor. So having open days at your site, immersive experiences like this one where we all dressed up and pretended to be Victorians, which was fun. Having events for specific audiences like families. If you've got an archaeological site, doing excavations. And again, in programming activities might not be sort of typical interpretation, it's not permanent, but still a really brilliant way to tell stories about the past and about your site for a range of visitors, particularly people who might, they might just visit once. And it can be a really good way of getting visitors who might not come to your site for just a kind of normal visit, but they might be much more interested in attending events. It's really important, as I said before, to think about audiences when you're interpreting. Ultimately, you are interpreting for people, so you've got to be really audience focused and think about people's needs. Good interpretation is accessible to everyone, but tailored to specific audiences. If you just say, we're going to make this interpretation available to everybody, you're not going to create great interpretation. You've really got to think about which specific audiences you're aiming at. So before you create your interpretation, define your audiences, your target audiences. That might be families, young people, older people, local people, UK tourists, international tourists, school groups. It could be a combination of those. Make sure they are absolutely defined in your mind before you decide what interpretation to create and how you're going to create it. Again, think about the impacts that you want to have on your audiences. So if it's for young people, what do you want them to go away with as a result of experiencing your interpretation? What are the needs of your audience groups? So think about that within your team or yourself. Those needs can be physical, sensory, and intellectual. For example, it could be that people require comfort. So family groups might need to sit, and older people might need space to sit down. Some groups might need the interpretation to be very interactive. Some people might need really good orientation around the interpretation. Families might want opportunities to learn together. So this was some interpretation at the Football Museum that we did with some artists. And you can't see it very well because of the picture, but it was all about women's football, but designed for under fives and their families. And there were incorporated within this lots of opportunities for families to play together and learn together, and also to sit down. Think about the writing style that you use, and also some groups might have time pressures. So there might be some groups that just want to very quickly experience the interpretation and go, and others might want longer. To define people's needs, it's really important to carry out, if you can, carry out research, actually talk to the audiences who you want to experience your interpretation via things like focus groups, interviews, surveys, to find out what they want and what their needs are. But you can also do this by doing an exercise that I just call thinking as the audience. So if you think about, okay, we want a family group, think about, well, who is this group? What does a good day out look like for them? What are their interests? What might be really interesting about your site to that group? What understanding might they already have about your site? What perceptions might they have? and how can you make your stories relevant to their experiences, and really go through that. So don't write interpretation for yourself, write it in with your audiences in mind. Think about accessibility. Interpretation should be accessible to everyone. I've listed like here a few examples of how to make interpretation accessible, but there are lots of things that you can obviously do depending on your budgets and depending what audiences you want to attract. I would say really think about talking to people with lived experience of having access needs, rather than deciding for them what they might like. But think about things like your text size, having visual breaks in the text, what the height is. Can people, can everybody see the interpretation? Is that height people can see? And then you can think about having things like British Sign Language tours and Braille guides, and just making sure that you've really thought about who can access this interpretation, who can't, and how can we make it more accessible. Subject matters, again, a topic we could talk about in much more detail, but we really wanted to include this because I think it is really important. Don't shy away from talking about difficult subjects. Your site might, have difficult histories to tell. I'd say don't shy away from it. Really consider your language. It's often better to just be really direct about what happened and factual. And also think about language that might have been used in the past. This is a very, maybe not the best example, but at Cork Abbey, a National Trust site, one of the former owners used to be referred to as isolated, and actually that was not the best word to use. It's not a word that we'd necessarily use today. And so they did a big project about loneliness and the need for sort of social connection. So think about language that might have been used in the past that maybe we need to revisit now. Work with people with lived experiences of subjects. If you're talking about racism, colonialism, imperialism, homophobia, for example, talk to people with experience of that. Don't make assumptions, is really important. Really think about the language you use, and also understand that the choices about what stories you tell isn't neutral. So whatever stories you tell, says what you want to say about a building. You're deciding what histories to interpret and in what way, and that means that you've taken a stance on that history. So really think about what stories you tell and in what ways, and who you're including and who you might be excluding. Think about whose stories and histories have been told in the past and whose stories might have been left out. Are there aspects of the history of your site people don't know about because there wasn't the research, or those stories have been traditionally left out? It's really important to tell stories of people, community, and events that reflect society. Heritage is for everyone, and it can give people a real sense of belonging, but it won't give people a sense of belonging if it's not inclusive, and some groups don't see themselves represented in the heritage. And it is really important that we think about who we're including in order to create welcoming, safe spaces for all. Interpretation planning, as I said, is a really important aspect of the process. You need to write a plan before you start. That will result in much more effective interpretation, and it will make sure that the interpretation you create meets audience needs and does what you want it to do. It's also really helpful for funding bids. As I've said, I've written a few interpretation plans for Heritage Fund funding bids. So if you do want to ultimately try and get funding, I would certainly suggest that you have an interpretation plan for your built heritage. You need to think about your objectives. Within an interpretation plan, you should be including your objectives, who your audiences are, what your big idea is, messages and themes, what interpretive methods you'll be using, what outcomes, so thinking about those generic learning outcomes again, what will people learn, how will people act as a result of experiencing your interpretation, what emotions will you evoke in people, and also how are you going to evaluate that your interpretation is doing what you want it to do. There are lots of examples of interpretation plans online, so I would say, look them up and you'll see some really great templates. And then just a few case studies in the last couple of minutes of just an interpretation that I've really liked. So in Montreal, I think it's still there, Cité Mémoire, there is big projections on buildings of stories that have happened in those buildings. It's absolutely beautiful. It's really playful interpretation that reveals hidden histories of those buildings at night. Images and music are projected onto buildings, and the characters that you see talk and give first-hand accounts of how the city's evolved. They use the built environment as a canvas. It's really magical, and I experienced it, and I had a real emotional connection to the people who experienced those buildings. It was also like the city was packed on the nights that they did it, and people of all ages are really, really enjoying it. And that's something that, you know, it's not a cheap interpretation, but really, really beautiful, impactful interpretation. Ottle Hall in Salford. I am from Salford, so this is probably a bit biased, but I really like this. When they redeveloped the hall, they wanted it to be more of a playful, immersive space where visitors could play and learn together. You can see that there's some objects in light wood. They're all replicas. So visitors know if they see an object that's in light wood, they can use it. So you can sit at that table and pretend to be at a feast. I didn't want to include the photo of me, but you can like get into bed, you can play with different things. It's really fun and a really nice way to bring a space to life and help people experience what it might have been like in the past. And then Nightwatch, the Tower of London, is a really good experience of how programming and events can tell brilliant stories about sites. So it was an after dark immersive experience by a digital theatre company. It's probably one of the best events I've ever done at heritage sites. Everyone got a phone, and you kind of got messages and phone calls to lead you around the Tower of London after dark, which was amazing. And it all reveals stories of spies and surveillance in the reign of Elizabeth I, but also thought about kind of modern day surveillance. So that real connection between the past and the present. It really felt like you were kind of privy to the secrets of the tower, and it really reached new audiences. Lots of younger people participated, people who might not necessarily make a visit to the tower in the daytime, what really wanted to experience that. It was fantastic. So just a few top tips. Again, just repeating what I've said really. Make sure you know your audiences. Who is your interpretation for? What are their needs? What are you interpreting? Why are you interpreting it? And what do you want to say about it? What impacts do you want your interpretation to have on visitors? Really consider your resources and create interpretation that meets those resources. Plan first and have your plan at the top of your mind throughout the process. Choose an appropriate method of interpretation for your audience and the space that you're working within, and evaluate. So find out what works, what doesn't work, and what lessons you've learned. Because, you know, when you go on to develop interpretation in the future, you can learn lessons from what you've done in the past. At the end of the presentation, I'm finishing now, but this will be on our website. I've done links to different things that might be of interest. There's a really great book by Steve Slack, who's a heritage consultant, who wrote a brilliant recent guide to how to interpret heritage. I've put a bit more about the lottery fund guidance for interpretation, which is great. A bit more about inclusive heritage from Historic England, that's really good. The Museum Gallery Scotland is also great. It's a really, really broad introduction to interpretation that's